2 years had passed since Ahsan's tragic death. The memory of that fateful day was still fresh in the minds of his family, as if it had happened just yesterday. He had died in a road accident, and his grieving family had buried him with their own hands. The pain of losing him was unbearable, and the void he left behind seemed impossible to fill. His younger brother Hamza still struggled to accept his loss, but life had moved on. The family tried to find solace in their daily routines, though the shadow of Ahsan's absence loomed large. That was until one fateful evening when Hamza received a Facebook notification that shattered his reality. It was an ordinary evening, and Hamza was scrolling through his phone trying to distract himself from the lingering sadness. A message from Ahsan's account popped up. Hamza's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the screen, unable to believe his eyes. "I am alive! Help me!" Hamza's hands trembled. The message was short but sent a chill down his spine. His brother was dead and buried. How could he be sending messages? The logical part of Hamza's mind told him it was impossible, but the message was right there, staring back at him. Thinking it was a hacker, Hamza clicked on the profile. He hoped to find some clue that would explain this bizarre occurrence. What he saw made his blood run cold. Ahsan's profile picture had changed. It was no longer the familiar, comforting image of his brother. It was no longer his usual smiling face. Instead, it was something eerie, something that sent shivers down Hamza's spine. Instead, it was a blurry, dark image. Something that looked like a hand rising from the ground. The image was haunting, almost as if it was trying to convey a message from beyond the grave. Trying to calm himself, Hamza assumed someone must have gained access to Ahsan's account. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He called his parents and showed them the message. They gathered around, their faces reflecting a mix of shock and disbelief. His mother burst into tears while his father, a religious man, frowned deeply. The sight of the message was too much for them to bear. "This is impossible," his father muttered. His voice was filled with a mix of anger and fear. "No soul returns after death." His words were firm, but there was a hint of doubt in his eyes. Either this is a cruel joke or something far more sinister is happening. The family was left in a state of confusion and fear, unsure of what to believe. But the horror was just beginning. Little did they know this message was only the start of a series of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about life and death. The next day, Hamza reached out to his best friend, Tahir, a tech expert. "Bro, someone is using my dead brother's Facebook. Can you trace it?" Tahir nodded and began tracking the IP address of the messages. A few minutes later, his face turned pale. "Hamza, this isn't possible." "What? What's wrong?" Hamza asked, feeling his heart race. Tahir turned the screen toward him, and Hamza's breath caught in his throat. The messages were coming from a location inside the local graveyard, the same graveyard where Ahsan was buried. Hamza felt a deep chill crawl up his spine. Someone, or something, was sending these messages from Ahsan's grave. That night, Hamza lay in bed, unable to sleep. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of his phone screen. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't control. His mind kept going back to Ahsan's messages. Each word seemed to echo in his head, growing louder with each passing minute. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Was it a hacker, a prank, or was there something far worse at play? His phone suddenly rang, shattering the silence of the night. The sound was jarring, almost surreal in the stillness of his room. The caller ID flashed a name that made his blood freeze. Ahsan, brother. Hamza's breath hitched. He stared at the screen, unable to believe his eyes. How could this be happening? His brother's phone had been buried with him. The memory of the funeral came rushing back, the sight of the phone being placed in the coffin. It was a final goodbye, a symbol of their bond. It had been switched off for 2 years. There was no logical explanation for this call. The phone should have been dead, just like Ahsan. Yet here it was, ringing in the dead of night. He hesitated, but answered the call. Hello?" His voice trembled, barely a whisper. A deep silence followed, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. Then, through heavy static, a whispering voice spoke. "Come to me. I need you." The words sent a chill down his spine, filling him with a dread he couldn't explain. Hamza threw the phone across the room, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Panic surged through him, his mind racing with fear and confusion. His father, hearing his terrified scream, rushed into the room. The look of concern on his face was evident, his eyes wide with worry. "What happened?" his father asked, his voice filled with urgency. Hamza could barely find the words to explain. Ahsan called me," Hamza stammered. The words felt foreign on his tongue, as if saying them out loud made them more real. His father stared at him for a long moment before saying firmly, "This is not Ahsan." His tone was resolute, leaving no room for doubt. "Whatever this is, it is trying to trick us." They needed answers. The night was far from over, and the mystery had only just begun. The next day, they visited an Islamic scholar, explaining the bizarre events, the Facebook messages, the call from Ahsan's buried phone, and the traced location from the graveyard. They were desperate for answers, hoping that the scholar could provide some clarity or at least some comfort in this bewildering situation. The scholar listened carefully and then said, "Islam teaches that the dead do not return." His words were calm, but carried a weight that made the family feel both reassured and more confused. Either this is the work of humans, or of unseen forces. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the gravity of his statement. The idea of unseen forces was unsettling, but the possibility of human interference was equally disturbing. Then he asked something that made everyone silent. His eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Have you ever doubted Ahsan's death?" Hamza's father frowned. The question hung in the air, heavy and ominous. "No, we saw his body, we buried him ourselves." The memories of the funeral flashed through their minds, the grief, the finality of it all. The scholar thought for a moment and then said, "Then you need to check his grave." His words were simple, but the implication was profound. That evening, Hamza, his father, and a few relatives went to the graveyard. The air was thick with tension, and every step felt like a journey into the unknown. The caretaker, an old man, looked at them strangely. His eyes were filled with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Why are you here so late?" he asked. Hamza explained everything. The caretaker's face paled. He had seen many things in his years, but this was different. "There's something you should see," he whispered. His voice was barely audible, but the urgency was clear. He led them to Ahsan's grave. The walk felt like an eternity, each step echoing in the silence of the night. What they saw made their hearts stop. The scene before them was something out of a nightmare. The soil on Ahsan's grave was disturbed, as if someone had been digging from the inside. Hamza stumbled back. The sight was both surreal and terrifying. His mother fainted on the spot. The shock was too much for her to bear. His father trembled as he recited Ayatul Kursi. The words of the prayer were a desperate attempt to find some semblance of peace. "Dig it up!" Hamza shouted. His voice was filled with a mix of fear and determination. The caretaker and the others dug feverishly. Each shovel of dirt removed felt like peeling back layers of a dark mystery. Within minutes, their shovels hit wood. The sound was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. The coffin was pulled out and carefully opened. The moment of truth had arrived. Silence fell over the graveyard. The coffin was empty. Ahsan's body was gone. The reality of the situation hit them like a tidal wave, leaving them in a state of utter disbelief. The police were immediately called. Investigations began, and soon, the truth unraveled. A truth far more terrifying than ghosts or jinn. A human trafficking gang had been operating in the area. They were involved in faking deaths, stealing bodies, and selling them. Ahsan had never truly died. His accident had left him in a coma, but instead of treating him, corrupt officials had declared him dead. His body was stolen before burial, and an empty coffin was placed in the grave. For 2 years, Ahsan had been held captive somewhere, trying to reach his family in the only way he could, through Facebook. His last message was not from beyond the grave. It was the desperate cry of a man still alive. Despite the investigation, Ahsan was never found. The police arrested several members of the trafficking ring, but his whereabouts remained unknown. His Facebook account was deactivated. His phone never called again. The only thing left behind was the disturbed grave, a chilling reminder that sometimes the dead don't speak, but the missing do. Islam teaches that the soul does not return after death, but the living can be deceived. Always seek the truth, and never ignore a cry for help, for compassion is a guiding light. Trust in faith over fear, and let it lead you.